So again, my name is David Schleper, and I grew up in Shakopee when I was 2 years old. My parents moved here with 5 children at that point. They ended up having 8. And like everything, I grew up here. I went to school at St. Mary's, which later became Sept, and then the public school, high school. But I never really learned a lot about the history of Shakopee. In the classes in school, I don't think they really talked that much about it. I ended up going, I graduated high school and I wanted to get out of here. So I left. I went to Australia for a year. I was an exchange student. I came back. I went to school in Colorado and then in Washington, D.C. And then I taught for 25 years in Washington, D.C. I worked with deaf students, teaching them how to read and write. I ended up coming back here because my mom had Alzheimer's. And most people, I felt kind of guilty, because I grew up Catholic, remember? So I felt I had to do something because my brothers and sisters were helping. And we had, for a long time, she still stayed at home. But every day, someone had to be there at her house, to help take care of her. So I finally moved back, and once I moved back, I decided, I just started getting interested in history. It's kind of funny because my dad is an American history teacher, was here in Shakopee. But I never took his classes because he's my dad. It was bad enough, that he was in the school. So I just remember that part. But it's interesting, but I do remember growing up that we used to travel a lot as a group, and we used to camp out. And we'd always, every time you'd see a little sign saying that there's something on the side of the road, my dad would always pull over and we had to look, at the ball of twine or whatever that was there, So I always had that interest in history. So today we're going to talk about some of the streets in Shakopee. It's hard because there are a lot of streets, and but I'm picking out a few that's kind of more interesting and how they kind of tie in. And so that's kind of our plan for today. And we'll be here until about noon is our plan. And so we can start. Our first slide is Dakota Street. And that's, you know where Dakota Street is in Shakopee?
I lived on 3rd and Dakota.
Yeah, well there you go.
I had your dad for a teacher.
Well, and there you go. So Dakota, obviously, just so you know, is obviously because Dakota is the name of the tribe that now is the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community, which is now in Prairie Lake, although it used to be in Shakopee. Now they're kind of combined a little bit of both together. But just to know, that's why where the Dakota Street is named there is for the people who were the Dakota. And it's important because in Shakopee, it didn't start when Thomas Holmes arrived here. Before then, there were 600 people who were living here. And that was in a village called Tinta Otamwa. And Tinta Otamwa, Tinta means prairie, and Otamwa means village. Okay? And it looked kind of like this. It wasn't so much teepees like you think of that, because this was a summer planting village. And they tend to have bark lodges here. And if you look at where they were located, they were here starting probably in the late 1600s in Shakopee, but it was probably on the other side of the river, the north side of the river. If you look at where Memorial Park is now, probably right across there is where Tinta Otamwa was for a while. By 1839, they moved to the south side. In other words, Memorial Park, but over a little bit further, is where the actual village was. But they also believed that it would move around every so often. And they did that for a reason, because it was for the grass to grow and the thing, that they didn't want to keep one place, so they moved around in the village. So Tinta Otamwa is that. Now it's interesting, you have Tinta Otamwa, but you don't have street sign named Tinta or Otama, really. We do actually, though. Oh, so just so you know then, so Chief Shakopee, this is how Shakopee is spelled, if you notice up there. They were a dynasty, actually, of at least 3 Shakopee chiefs. And the second one is the one that the name of the town was named after. So it was called Tinta Otanwa, but it was also called, I think, 8 different names at one point. I think, in fact, oh, there's powerful names here if you want more information. That lists all of the names of Shakopee. Before it became Shakopee, the name we now know. But Chief Shakopee was, they said, was a man of good sense, sound judgment, and some note among the Indians for his ability as an orator. He was really a good speaker. And he would stand in, they were like 2 little village area, and he would speak, everybody would listen to. And that was what Samuel Pond said. So this is actually a picture of what he looked like. And this is Chief Shakopee. So there is a Chief Shakopee 1, and there's a Chief Shakopee 3 also, just so you know. But the one that named the town is this one. And so when we talk about Tinta and Tinta Tama, if you look at the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community area, there's a Tinta Lane, okay? And in Shakopee we got Prairie Street, okay, which is basically the same word, really, and the same thing. But that's why they're tied in again with the same. And it's because in Shakopee there was about, they said that this is when people were there, before other white people were there, this used to be all prairie. From at least 4 miles, just a flat prairie from the river straight back at least 4 miles. It was all prairie. And it's interesting because after, by in the 30s, I think 20s or 30s, there's no prairie in this area of Scott County. And it's interesting because that's when the Dust Bowl happened, because there's no more prairie. Now they're slowly adding a little bit more prairie, and so they're adding it more back into the area. And so now you look and decide, let's just take prairie around this area. If you look even in like Memorial Park, there is some mounds there, and they've left them now in prairie. And every so often they burn that prairie so it dries off, and then new comes out. There's lots of flowers there. All right, another street that you find here in Shakopee is Faribault Street. And when you think of Faribault, sometimes you think of this city in southern Minnesota. But the Faribault family actually had several boys in the family who were traders, and they traded to the Indians. And the one who lived in Shakopee was Oliver Faribault, and he married Wankanyanka. And Wankanyanka was a Dakota woman. They could speak, well, Oliver could speak French, that's what he normally spoke. Then he spoke Dakota, and then he spoke English. So he had 3 languages. Wanka, for the most part, spoke almost always in Dakota. She was later anglicized into the name Harriet Faribault. Sometimes you find that word out, but her actual name was Wakinaka, and that's what they used to call her. And you know that there was actually the cabin of Oliver Faribault and Wakinaka that was built in Shakopee in 1844. So that was before it became Shakopee, but when it was Tinta Otanwa. There was an area that in part of Memorial Park, kind of across the river there, is a stream called now called Faribault Springs. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. It doesn't look like it used to look like, but it still is a stream there where there's 3 underground springs that popped up there. And the water was so good that you could drink, just right from the stream, right? And they built their cabin there, and it was a trading post, a cabin, a warehouse, and there was a horse barn. I know that too because I was reading about that recently. The building was in downtown Shakopee. You know where Dangerfields is now? Or what else is down there? There are a few other places down, right?
Big stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so right there, across the way, is where they lived. Okay, and it was they stayed there, and they lived there in this actual cabin that is on the right there until about 1949, and then they built another house right next to it. Before that, before 1949, they still had to go down to the stream to get water. They didn't have, indoor facilities of any kind. The house itself now is moved to the landing in Shakopee, which is, where the landing is. And so it's as an example of a trading post from that time. But it's actually from here in Shakopee. The place now where they live is now, what's left is torn down now, and that area is now part of the Dakota community because there are graves on that site also. And that was the Shakopee battle with the Northern Indians and that fight that happened.
So where's Faribault Street then?
Is not there. There's a couple in the town, and it's not like near the.
Up by the hospital.
By St.
Yeah, I
Francis.
was just to say, I think it's by the hospital, but I
It's
wasn't
like
sure.
east of St. Francis.
Near St.
East of it.
Yeah.
East of St. Francis. So but at least it's there, and you know that there's a Faribault, the city of Faribault. That was Oliver's brother who set up that town. So just so you know why there's a connection. Now, why don't you know so much about Oliver Faribault? Because he was 35 years old when he got Quincy, which is like a bad sore throat, and he died. So you don't really hear so much. After that, his wife, Wanka and their 4 daughters that were living there stayed, and then their generation stayed in the same place. Okay. And Sarah Faribault, which is one of their daughters, said, "My father, Oliver Faribault, built a house, which was his home and trading post, near Little Six, or Shakopee's village, in 1844. And it was a good place because there were 3 villages nearby, the Good Roads, Black Dogs, and Shakopee's. And he was a successful trader. And he was until he died awfully young." It's also interesting because Sarah also talked about, there used to be a sacred stone here. It's not there anymore, right? But it used to be in the prairie below Shakopee, okay? And people used to, the Indians would lie down there, they'd rest, they'd dance, they would sing, they would have a council there. They always went there before they went into battle. And what's interesting is that Sarah remembers, she said, they used to leave gifts which the white people stole. Okay? I remember taking some things from it myself, she said. I passed a party of Indians with it in my hand. So she had something that she got from the thing that someone left. And a Dakota woman saw what I had and became very angry. She made me take it back. She seemed to feel as if we would if our church had been violated. So it was something that she remembers because it was such a, you know, embarrassing probably thing for her that she remembers about that. And also just about the cow shed, which is kind of interesting, but they had a they had a horse, I think, and it was right next to the log cabin, so again, down in downtown Shakopee. And almost every place in Shakopee, once that became a town, they used to always have cows and horses there. But there used to be a reverend who used to borrow the horse, and sometimes they hid his cow also. And one time, because of that, Dakota killed the cow. And they also have oral tradition that's a story that they had furs in the shed and that a mixed blood employee of Faribault's used to guard the fur that was kept here. So it's just interesting that that's what used to happen here in Shakopee. Now this, actually, I have to say, this is for talking about Samuel Pond and his wife Cordelia Eggleston Pond. And I said Pond's Way, but you know, I have to say, Pond's Way is probably about a pond someplace. It's probably not about Samuel Pond. And it's certainly not Cordelia Eggleston Pond, which they always forget, which is basically his wife and also a missionary. But this is Samuel Pond, and I just make a note of that because in 1847, remember 1844, the Faribault cabin was built. Right across that stream was where the Pond Mission House was built, and this is what it looked like. And that was in 1847. So these would probably be, if you want to think about it, would be the two new buildings that were built. But remember, before then, the Dakota were there for over 150 years, okay, before this happened. And if you go, you can go down across from Dangerfield and over a little bit, and you'll actually see this is the foundation of their house. And this is what it looked like. This is 1909, right before it was torn down. Okay. And I mention this because the Shakopee Heritage Society now has that land for the purpose of having the history of Shakopee, because it was where the Faribault were living, it was where the Ponds were living, which are two really important families in the fur trade, and the missionaries, and it was also the location of Tinta Otama, where the Dakota were living. And so we're doing signs there that's tied into that. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And you know, there is actually, oh, that's an old thing, sorry, I just realized the bottom thing. But this is actually, if you go to Valley Cemetery, you know where that is, it's where, on 4th Avenue, 4th Street I should say, what used to be, or is still I think, right across from Mr. Pillow guy.
Just past
Now, I should say. Anyway, there is the cemetery with Reverend Pond and his wife, who died in Massachusetts when they brought her back when she was not feeling well, and then she died pretty early also. So this is not actually a tombstone, it's I don't know what you call it, the person, when you have a thing, but it's not a real tombstone, but it's a memorial of some kind. There is another name for that, but I just can't remember that out of my head. All right, here's another interesting one. You've seen the Stagecoach Road, possibly. Have everybody seen that area? If you go on 101 and head down there, you'll see a sign that turns that way. That's the Stagecoach Road. And that location where it was the Gellerbeck stage stop from 1849 to 1880. And they say that really the stage used to cross really Indian trails, is kind of what they followed, and then over the Bloomington Ferry, and they arrived at the stage stop, which is about 4 miles from the old, used to be where Shakopee. Now Shakopee is kind of expanded beyond that, but the old place, okay. Then they would change horses and head to Shakopee. And the first time that a stagecoach arrived in Shakopee was October 6, 1853. And then they used to keep the horses in a barn that used to be near the old St. Paul Hotel in Shakopee, which would be located now, if you know where the Scott County Historical Society is, right across the road there. And that's the actually the stage barn before it was torn down. But the stagecoach, well, first of all, they do talk about the people in the stagecoach. They used to complain about the mosquito problem. And I can imagine too, but they said they were larger than the usual size and more painful. And their attack was more bold and determined. And their numbers were like the atoms in the air. They were bad. That was before they sprayed, for that thing too, and you can just imagine what it was like. But, starting 1951 to 1981, they had the stagecoach here. And I don't know if you remember I remember growing up there, we used to go there. And they would have like displays there of things from the past. It was just kind of an interesting place. And they had a lot of guns, I think. They had like old guns from different times.
Yeah, there was a gentleman by the name of Ozzy.
Yes, I think I have a picture of him actually. Yeah. There, he was on the left there, and that's the And they had this little thing in the back. It was called the Sandberg Gulch, and they had like a like old animatronic kind of thing, and they'd tell the story of the thing, whatever. It was quite interesting. I remember it and really enjoyed doing that, going there. And we used to, whenever visitors would come, we'd always go there too. So it's too bad it's not still there, actually.
I got one thing to say.
Yeah.
And that was when my mom and dad were out courting and stuff like that there. They used to have, and I think they dug up all the footings and stuff like that there.
Mostly
But
yeah.
in the barn there, they had barn dances at that time. And sometimes the river would overflow, and then they'd rent boats to get across.
Oh, interesting. I know, it really is funny how they, because there's a lot of stories about the river and how much it was used as a way to really transportation around. And even in the 1911, I think it was, maybe a little before then, they used to have a boat that would go from here to St. Paul. And then you had a boat, and then tied into it was another little boat that had musicians there. And people would go there and you'd dance on the river to St. Paul, and you'd arrive by 12 midnight. And you'd take the 12 midnight train back to Shakopee. And it was really critical because if you didn't arrive on time, you'd be in trouble because then you had to wait till the next day. And they used to, it was really very popular. And so young people, teenagers and in the 20s, whatever, would go a lot. It got so bad that the priests and other people were preaching that they need to stop doing this. This is an awful thing. You should not be dancing in the river, I guess. So it was a big thing, apparently. But unfortunately, when he would say that, then more people would go because it's like, well, I'm curious too. So it would do it. It happened for a long time, and then at one point, I know there's a story that at one point they got there and they were late and they didn't get the train back, and of course that was just like a huge upset thing in the whole downtown because all these people, these kids were, I suppose they had to be at a hotel or something, so.
Didn't they have they called it the Opera House down there?
Yes, in
They used
this
to have
area it was
plays
an opera, yeah. And they used to sing, have like kind of old-fashioned kind of thing. It was really cool. I really do remember that very well too. Okay, so then we continue on and we talk to Home Street now because we're kind of moving on after this, the Indians that were there who are still here. And then we have the Faribaults, and we have the ponds, and we have this stagecoach that's going on. And then we have Home Street, and that's really for Thomas Holmes. And Thomas Holmes, some people call him the father of Shakopee, but again, I have a problem with that because there were people living there for almost 200 years before that. But yeah, here's where it says, in the history of Minnesota Valley, they say Thomas A. Holmes was the actual first settler, but actually 600 people were living there, you know. So, if he had said was the first white settler, it might have worked okay, but okay. But we do know that Thomas Holmes and Bill Quinn, who was really the guide, packed. They were looking for a place for the town. Now, Bill Quinn is interesting because he was actually part Cree Indian, and he could speak Dakota and Ojibwa and other languages, so that really helped. And they head down the St. Peter's River, which is what Shakopee was before it became Minnesota River, and they came right past Tintotanwa, and they pulled in there. And that's where they thought, well, this could be a good place for a town. And he called, so again, remember we're talking about the powerful names that there used to be. This place used to be called Holmes Landing before it became Shakopee, okay? And sometimes people have said it was called Holmesville, but when I've looked at actual written information, they usually talk about Holmes Landing as the name of this town was. And he built this trading post for the Dakota. And they say that if you look at where the location of Tintotanwa, they say it probably starts on Somerville Street and go all the way to beyond Memorial Park, was that area, and then back about 3 miles. And of course, I just make this because this related to history all the time. So we talk about this, but you talk about this person who actually brought him here and said, here's a good location, Quinn, but there's not a Quinn Street in Shakopee. So it's just interesting because he was an interesting person. His mother was a Cree Indian. And he had gotten good education at Fort Snelling, and he went to a boarding school in Fort Garry, which is in British North America. And he married a Dakota woman. They had 3 children. But I just mentioned this because it's just like everything else. He's had a big input because he was the one who was actually riding the boat and telling Tom where to stop as a possible town, but his name is not picked there for anything. They should have a Bill Quinn Street, just like they should have Wankanyanka Street too, and Oliver Faribault Street.
What is British North America?
That would be, now it's Canada.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
At that time, that's what it was called, so that's why I did it
Okay,
there.
thank you.
So, okay. Remember Oliver Faribault we talked about before? Oliver's brother is David Faribault. And we do have a picture of David, so I make a note of this just because you notice that he is actually part Dakota. You can see it in his look. And it's important to know that because their mother was either half or full Dakota. okay? And he married this woman, which was Winona Nancy McClure Faribault Huggin. She's been around. But she was about, I think, 15 or 16 years old when they got married. But why it's important is because there's the person who drew this picture said she was the most beautiful woman in Minnesota. And again, Faribault Street. And it's interesting because David and most people will call her Nancy. David and Nancy, when Oliver died, David Faribault and Winona Nancy McClure Faribault Huggins moved to a house just below Oliver's house. So again, where would that be located? Probably where Dangerfields is now, that location, okay? And they stayed there only for 2 years. But while they were there, remember that further, which location? West of the Faribault family was where the Thomas Holmes trading post was. And David Faribault said, well, I think this area, which is a little further east, that's where should be a town instead. So they were kind of competing. You know, it could have been like Minneapolis and St. Paul, I guess, but it really took off. But it didn't really stay so well. So they were trying to do that and have that.
With her name having all those names,
Yeah.
if she was only as old as she was when they got married, does that mean that she was married all those times before, or was that names her parents passed down?
No, those were her own when she got married. First, second, third, fourth. So she'd been married once already,
Holy cow.
and then she got the Faribault. Then she got the 2 or 3 others after that. Yeah.
She must have started getting married when she was about 12.
Yes. Unfortunately, but that was kind of the way it was. So just so you know.
Okay.
Okay. So in the history of Minnesota Valley, they talk about when about the same time that Mr. Holmes arrived, David Faribault, a brother of Oliver, arrived, and they wanted to have a rival town. But they had a group of people who started, who was a colony of, they called them French half-breeds, which really is, they're just Medi. In other words, they were part white and part Indian families that were living around there, but then they ended up abandoning it. They don't really have much more information about that. But we do know that the location, if you look at, so this is just in order to see this, here's the Amazon fulfillment place here, right? Just so you can think where we're looking at. This is 4th Avenue, which used to be the main street down in Shakopee, way, way back, okay? And this is Saracen Street, okay. Tintotanwa used to be on this side of the river from 1823 to 1839, excuse me, and then it moved over to this side of the road until 1858. And here's Memorial Park right here. Here's the landing. This is where the battle that happened at one point, that people used to sit over on this side and watch the battlefield happening. And that's where the corn and gardens were. Just, you know. And it's also interesting because the rice fields were right across the river too. And if you drive over Flying Cloud Drive and you look down, you know, that area, that was all the rice fields, and that's where people used to do their ricing. So again, David and Nancy, the town is gone. There's nothing left there. And just when you talk about Winona Nancy McClure Faribault Huggins, it's just interesting that she was born around 1836 with an Army sergeant and her mother. But they were really, she was tied into a lot of Dakota chiefs. And the other thing is that was very common back then during the, with the fort at Fort Snelling, as well as in the fur trades, that often white men would marry a Dakota woman in order to have a connection for trade. Sometimes they really married. Most of the time it was not a real married, it was just a thing to do in order to have that connection. And then, like in this situation, they're together and then he moves to Florida. Says bye, and then he ends up marrying somebody else, later. So that's just the way he did it. So anyway, so just so you know that she was 16 years old at that time. And they do talk about her because she once said, she said she was wondering how much champagne got out when they had this big thing in 1851. But they did. But they did end up separating at one point, and then she ended up getting married again and again. So that's why. All right, David L. Fuller Street. So we have Fuller Street here in Shakopee. You know where that is? Right over that way? Okay. I'm tying this in because I think it's really interesting. That's actually a picture of David Faribault, but I don't know if that's true, but that was what the drawings did anyway of him. But they also had the Fuller Hotel in St. Paul. And I bring this up because the Faribault family, there were 3 brothers and 3 sisters. They arrived in St. Paul in 1850. And David Faribault arrived to Shakopee in 1851, and then he came back, and with Thomas Holmes, they made kind of an agreement, so that David had half the town. So Thomas Holmes had half, and Fuller's had half of the town area at that time. Okay. He also, David also did Chesta Township also at the same time. So in other words, David Fuller had a lot of money, okay? And I think Thomas Holmes was desperate for money, and so that's why they split the town that way, too. They were merchants. There were 3 of them, actually, the brothers. And they owned a store in St. Paul and trading posts in the territory and real estate business. And then they had 3 girls. And they ran the house with the help of a servant and a gardener. And there's actually, you go on the Minnesota Historical Society, and they actually have lists of, Lizzie Faribault used to document every little thing, and they have all that kind of information, so it's kind of interesting about the Fullers. But it is interesting that the Fuller house, which is in St. Paul, was built in 1856. It was 5 stories high and 120 square feet, and was paid $110,000 for that. But what's interesting is that slaveholders and other Southerners spent vacation at the hotel. And the hotel owners, which were the Faribault, our Fullers, which would include David, would get money because they would be paid for their lodging. And they had the slaves actually were living in the hotel also. So they used to get about $6,000 a month. So that's why they had the money then to buy half of Shakopee and so on. So it's just kind of interesting. And it's because it's interesting to the slavery in Minnesota is that they used to travel here because they allowed that they were not citizens and they couldn't get their freedom really at that point. And so people used to, from the South, used to come up here and nobody could do anything. And that's important because then what you have then, anyway, David ends up dying in 1856, but then other of his brothers continue on here, both in Shakopee and there. Okay, but I bring this up because this person, he's African American, and it's interesting because the Underground Railroad that we talk about, you know, we always talk about that, but it's always over in the eastern part of the United States, but there was actually an Underground Railroad that was happening here in Minnesota. And they used to go from south and go up, and then they'd send them up and out to Canada for the same reason. I just bring it up because, well, this person, Joseph Farr, ended up coming here, and he worked at a barber shop, but he also would go to, whenever the steamboats would come, he would go, and there was lots of slaves who were there working in the steamboats, and he would ask them if they want to escape or not, and if not, then he would take them. So it's just kind of interesting. And I bring it up because the Fuller Hotel, that later was called the International Hotel, was patronized by Southern people. And they had, one time there was a slave who was there, and they thought, well, we could, you know, free her if they wanted to. So she told them that she'd get away and that they would like to go. So they had a plan, and they brought her in to a place. They were getting ready for her to disappear. It took a couple days in order to happen, and then they said at some point, the girl got kind of homesick for her master's family and insisted on going back, which is just such a conflict of what happened. But it's interesting because they say, of course, there was not use trying to help a slave to escape when she didn't want to, and so we let her go back. And that's just kind of the way it would happen. But there are examples where the Fuller House were involved with big slave-related drama. In 1860, a person had a slave, and he escaped by escaping out the building. So again, I tied that all in because we have to, when we think about Shakopee and we say, well, there weren't slaves here. Well, actually, there were slaves. But also, there were people who profited off slavery, even here in Minnesota. And Fuller's is one of them. All right, Shumway. You know where Shumway Street is here? Okay. If you look at the Shakopee story that we have over here, they talk about, you know, the Thomas home loaded a stock of goods and some building materials on the flat bottom wild paddy. And the boat was propelled by sails and pikes, being operated by John McKenzie and Emerson Shumway. So we'll talk about Emerson Shumway. But we're going to talk about, more importantly, Mahala Conklin, because she was living in Shakopee, and she was working with, there was the Haywood family here in Shakopee, who had a shanty on what used to be Home and First Street in 1852. And they worked there until the Haywood left. Then she worked with William Holmes, which is the brother of Thomas Holmes, and his wife, Susanna Shook Holmes, which later was in Jordan, Minnesota. And then they ended up getting married with Emerson Shumway, remember, and Mahala Conklin. And it's interesting because you look at some of the book, like there's a book called, I think we have it here somewhere, The Sketch of Shakopee in 1891. And the person who writes, they can't even remember the poor woman's name, a servant girl, M/ and then later it was Conklin, who afterwards worked for William Holmes' family, and the next year married Emerson Shumway. Well, that M was Mahala, and that was the story. So people talk about, so what happens, where are the Shumways? Well, in the fall of '52, Shumway had smallpox, And after his recovery, he moved to St. Paul. And in 1857, he and his wife and their children were murdered on the plains by the Indians. This is what says the book here. Now I bring that up because, again, another book, The History of Minnesota Valley, says they joined a wagon train to California and was killed in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I'm like, oh, you know, so for me as a history person, I'm like, ooh, what is that? And I want to find out more about that. Well, I found out, first of all, that people were heading to, there were 120 immigrants passing through southern Utah in 1857. And they were killed by a group of Mormons with help of the local Indians. And you can go online and find so many interesting things about that. But basically, the Mormons there circled the wagon, entered with a white flag, convinced them to surrender, and put down the guns, so they did. Then they escorted them out, and then they were killed. Okay? And they said it was sworn to secrecy. And so when this later came out, even the Mormons finally said, like, oops, sorry, you know.
What was the point?
They were trying to get rid, they didn't want them here in that area. Okay? Just weird, but it's just thing. It's really an awful part of history, but what I want to say is that we know that they weren't involved. So even though the newspapers, the books, talk about the Shumways going involved in this, they didn't even head west until 1859. So it's just interesting how you have to really look at lots of places to find the history. We do know that in 1859, the Shumways did cross the plains with Ox team. They were engaged in prospecting and mining in California and Nevada. They ran a stock ranch for 20 years, and they both ended up dying in 1909 in Oregon. Okay? And we have a picture. So when you talk about Shumway Street, that's Benjamin Emerson Shumway. And there's Mahala Compton Shumway. So it's just kind of interesting, again, how the history of tie-in. And so but why was the name Shumway named here in Shakopee? Remember when they were looking for streets, they're just making up the people who are living there and they're giving them names for some of the places that were there at that time.
Is there tombstone in the cemetery around here?
Not here, in Oregon.
Oh, it's in Oregon,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, which is interesting, but again, that's where they were only here for a couple of years.
Oh, okay.
In Shakopee, but because they were important parts, because they were the first people here with Thomas Holmes, he helped build the trading post there, so they put their name there and was there. Now we talk about Apgar Street also, okay? And that's really Daniel and I can't even say anything. I love some of the names of some of the people back then. It's kind of fun, but anyway. And again, when you go to the thing, here's what it talks when they bring up the name. Okay, when they built that first trading post, it was a very small building. A year later, they built a bigger one next to it, and the small one became where Daniel Apgar lived in the beginning when they came here. So I'm going to talk a little bit of Melinda Perry Apgar. They kept a small house for travelers. It was basically, there's a picture of, here's the Holmes trading post, but down below was the original one. And this is the one that they lived in, okay? And where would it be located? It would be, if you look at Holmes Street, but then further, right next to the river. So further there's not a thing. But at that time, in 1852, Melinda was one of 4 white women in the settlement. The other 3 are her daughters and daughter-in-law, okay? But what's interesting is the story about a Dakota woman and Henry Marco, I should say, and Melinda. And what happened is, in 1852, there's a woman right across the river, over like when you talk about, again, Memorial Park right across there, and a woman was gathering wood for a fire. And Henry McCord was here. He saw the woman and he shot her. Why? I guess because he was there, he was afraid, I don't know. The woman was ready to try to fight back, but then was killed, or hit. She was not killed. Henry then runs to a cabin and locked him in there because the woman is screaming and the other Dakota came to see it. So they knew that something was going on and they knew that Henry was the person who did it. But the Dakota decided instead of just attacking Henry, they would go to Thomas Holmes and ask him what to do. So when that happened, then Thomas Holmes got the people from Fort Snelling. They came and they arrested him brought him to Fort Snelling. The woman was really was bloody and she's not doing well. But what happened was Melinda was again one of the few white people there. She would go to the woman almost every day and she'd give him food, she'd help her. And slowly the Dakota woman got better. And the Dakota woman, once she was well, often would bring Melinda and her family a generous share of the day's hunt for her kindness. And so it's a great story. We don't know the name of the Dakota woman. We know that the Dakota's husband was part of the top head person of the Dakotas. But that's all we know about it. But it's just interesting that Melinda, even though she didn't really know Dakota, she's pretty, there's 600 Dakota Indians there, but she went ahead and did what she felt was right. And so it's interesting when we talk about Apgar, we talked a lot about Melinda's husband and the name Apgar Street, but they really should have a Melinda Perry Apgar Street because she really did a good thing, and we need to support people who are doing the right things. And if you go to Valley Cemetery, you will find there's Melinda's gravestone, and then they added a new one, afterwards because it was just kind of falling apart. Now, Somerville Street, another interesting one. John and Sophronia. I just love the names of some of the people back then. I wish they would bring them back. I kind of like them. But anyway, don't you want to have a little child named Sophronia? Sophie, yeah, exactly. All right. He was born in Vermont. He was in the lumber business. He came to Shakopee in the spring of 1851 with Thomas Holmes, and he was a commissioner for Scott County. But in 1864, there's one of 3 wagon trip, Holmes wagon trains that went to Montana for gold at that time. There were 3 different times that happened. And Holmes was the head person, and then a group of maybe 200 or 300 people actually went to Montana to either and then live there or came back broke, one way or the other. So John and Sophronia came and went there because they wanted to get some money from the gold. And what's interesting is there's research in Montana that shows that there was a place called Last Chance, and they wanted a name. So in October of 30th, 1864, they decided they were going to vote. And John Somerville, the one from Shakopee, was there. Well, actually, he was from Helena, I think, actually, which is right here at that point. But he was very tall. He said he was about 6'4", so it kind of stood up. But all the miners got to guess what name do they want to have this town. And people would say like Squash Town or Pumpkinville. And they also brought in Winona, Rochester, Toma, you know, from what they remember from the past. But then Somerville stood up and said, I propose we name it Helena after Helena, Minnesota in Scott County. Oops, County. That's where I'm from, and that's the best town in the best county in the best state in the Union. And that is really, they actually document this. It's kind of interesting. Now, Helena won by 2 votes. They voted, okay. But they ended up calling it Helena because in 1883, there was a hack driver who misspelling the name Helena on the door of his hack. So that's why there's, I don't know, I can't even think of myself because I have to, with my stroke, but Helena, let me see. You know the place in Montana, what's it called?
Helena.
Yeah. Versus here, it's the town or the area. So the tie-in is really tied into that.
But are they still the same?
What's that?
They're spelled
It's spelled the same, yeah. So
And
just
where's
kind of
it here?
interesting story. Now, what's that?
Where's it here?
Right, it's actually
The township, like outside of New Prague.
Yeah, New Prague. But he originally came here. Now, what's interesting is they ended up coming back here. They got some good money, my understanding. So Frina ended up dying here in 1872 and was buried at Valley Cemetery here in Shakopee. John Somerville died from a large wart on the back of his right hand. They said he had a wart and he was trying different ways to try to remove it and he couldn't figure it out. It finally turned into cancer, what extended up his arm and into his body. And at one point he ended up dying. He was penniless in St. Paul at the home of the Little Sisters of the Poor. And he was 79 years old. And he was buried here in Shakopee also. So it just makes an interesting story about Somerville Street. And of course, you know where you can find the Somerville tombstone? Same place, okay? Valley Cemetery. If you really, the older things, a lot of them are there, so. Now here's another one that's kind of interesting. There's a Holmes Street and a Hazen Street. Holmes Avenue, Hazen Street is over by St. Francis Hospital in that area. Hazen Moore married this woman, Gray Cloud woman. Hazen Moore is well known in Minnesota because he had trading posts. I know that one time there's a story that I think in 1829 that he came down from Fort Snelling in boats with 126 packs of fur, valued at $12,000. I mean, that's a lot of money. Excuse me, a lot of money. And he moved to several other places. But what's interesting is that at some point, well, the other thing that's really interesting is that he did marry this woman, but they really were connected as opposed to just a woman for convenience in order to tie into the Dakota that's around. This was actually really a wife, and they were together for forever, till the end, I think. And they used to say that Hazen used to follow the old customs of generosity and reciprocity. And he used to give credit with a generous hand. And so much so that sometimes they didn't even like, because they were trying to change that in a different way. So anyway, at some point, there was a place called Gray Cloud Island, that's here in Minnesota, near Fort Snelling area. And they continued farming. And then in the fall of 1846, Hazen and his wife moved to Tinta-O-Tano, which is here in Shakopee. At that time, it was also known as Prairieville because Samuel Pond translated Tinta-O-Tano into Prairieville, and later it was named Shakopee. In fact, Samuel Pond once said that he had too many Indian visitors who shared with him the products of his farm, so that he did not succeed as a farmer. That's at least in Pond's standard. But he had a high regard for his character and observed that people that knew him could hardly help regretting that he would bring his lot to spend so much of his time among savages. I should do savage quote, but it was the way it was written, so. It is not the people from Savage, right? Good. Well, some of them. All right. So, just so you know, Gray Cloud Woman's father was James Aird, who was the cousin of Robert Burns, the poet. Okay, they got married. She got married to Thomas Anderson. After 8 years, they broke up. Then they married Hazen, and they came again to here. They were there for a couple of years here in Shakopee. Then they moved to Black Dog Villages, and she died there with her Dakota relatives. And they say that she was buried in the site of her mother, in what is now Eagan, Minnesota. But if you go, like a lot of schools are named after this woman, and there's also a lot of information about Hazen Moore. They're very well known in Minnesota in what they did or do. And if you look at it from fall of 1846 to the spring of 1849, Hazen and his wife built a cabin about 10 rods, or about 55 feet north of the Pond Mission House. So if you know where the Pond Mission House again, which is again across from Memorial Park there, so probably you know where the duck pond is downtown? Right in that area is probably where they lived. And they lived there with John Moore and Rosaline. I'm like translating their names in the thing. But they were both farmers there. This is their daughter, or their son and his wife. Iron Woman, that's what they call her. And they, of course, also lived in Shakopee for a few years. But it's interesting because their grandson, which is Thomas Anderson Robertson, who is the grandson of Gray Cloud Woman. And he talks about this woman who they say is by no means unattractive, okay? But they said that, Thomas said that one time they had there were some horses that were stolen by another group of Indians. And when they got together, they had to get the horses back. And in order to do that, you have to kind of talk about your own family and how they tie in. So Thomas mentioned that his grandmother was Gray Cloud Woman. And they said they knew right away who she was. And they said she had fed many of them the winter of the Great Famine, when so many of them starved to death getting back from the winter hunt. And then immediately they returned the horses and they left. So again, what a nice person you want to remember, right? And so again, there should be some signs in Shakopee about them also. Not just Hazen, but his wife also. All right. There's Murphy Avenue saw that one, where it was. I just drove around town and took pictures, so.
That's by
This is,
Veerling Drive.
Where is it?
It's like Veerling East, kind of by the fire
East.
station.
So this is Major Richard Murphy. He was born in 1801 in Tennessee. He ended up coming to Minnesota in 1847. And he ended up being in the first state Senate in Minnesota. They got married. They had 5 children. Then she died, had another child, another wife, I should say. They built the Murphy's home. The home is now, you can find it, it looks like this, but now it was torn down, or burnt down actually. But the remains are still in the landing. This place, of course, is now part of Shakopee, right, where the landing is. But back then it was like out of town area. It was the place for the party. This is where you go if you want to go dance and have fun, okay? They had a big house and apparently it was very popular for that. All right, let's continue on. Spencer Street. The parents of the people who are named Spencer is Spire Spencer and his wife, who's also his cousin, whose last name is Spencer. So it's actually both Spears, Spencer, and Rose and Spencer. Okay. They came from Kentucky, moved to St. Paul, then to Shakopee. And again, remember how we had the town was split in half with Home Street and Fuller Street? Now they moved that, and now a third of the town is now from Holmes and Fuller, was purchased by Spencer for $4,100. They got married, and they had a store on the riverbank west of Atwood Street. They sold groceries and dry goods on the first floor of the building and lived in the upper story. The building is not there anymore, obviously. No, they didn't. He did, which is the one thing. You know, I always look for that thing, but no, he didn't. But he also bought the Flora Clark, and he was engaged in the river traffic that was going on there. So he was making some good money with that also. But it's also interesting because in 1862, through an accident, he became totally blind. I think he had a wheat thing or whatever that hit into his eye. I don't know, it got into both eyes, how it was that. But anyway, he ended up selling his farm and opened a private boarding house here in Shakopee called the Union Home. And eventually, because of course he couldn't see anymore, he used to learn the broom making trade, which he worked until 1895. And this was in one of the newspaper in Shakopee about, brooms manufactured by Spire Spencer on the corner of 2nd and Fillmore Streets. Okay. He ended up dying in 1907 and buried at the same place at Valley Cemetery. I'm doing pretty quick on this one, but Wakefield Circle, Wakefield Court. There was in town a doctor, Dr. Wakeman, and his wife. His wife ended up, the reason we bring this up is that she actually wrote a book about her experience 6 weeks in a teepee when she was in 1862, when the U.S.-Dakota War happened. She was taken, and she ended up getting freed eventually, but she basically told her story in there, and the book is quite interesting, I think. This is what she looked like. Nice hat. But she was, they did, you know, I think she was, they were pretty rich. But she was, her husband was the doctor here in Shakopee for a short time before they moved to the agency in 1862. They think that he, the wife, the husband I should say, kind of would beat her sometime or whatever, so there wasn't a real good relationship. She got help by a person named Chaska, who was a Dakota Indian, and that's how she was freed. But some people said it's because the two of them had an affair. But she says no, he was just a nice person and helped her. And what ended up happening is that Chaska ended up hung in the U.S. Dakota War. And she was mad, and that's why she wrote the book. Okay. And Marshall Road, you know where Marshall Road is, right? Everybody should know that one. That's because if you go, you know where St. Francis is now, that's the third hospital, but if you go up that hill there, on the right side is the Marshall Farm. And that's been there forever, you know, obviously. I think from 1862, I think it was. And now the land around it has all been sold off, right? But the thing is still there. Yeah. There's actually a picture of when they were working there at that time. And here's what it says. I'm going to let you read it for a second while I check my time. All right. They lived there for 6 generations. It's interesting. They paid $1,200 in 1862 for 120 acres. Boy, don't you wish you had that money now? All right. So anyway, they had eventually the first generation. The second was Anton, and then he got married to Catherine. They had 5 sons and 4 daughters. Okay. At that time, the road was not called Marshall Road. It was called Spring Lake Road. But I'm going to talk about Catherine again, which was Siebenarl Marshall. They decided she wanted to go to church. Okay. The weather was good, and they decided, you know, it'd be nice to get away. So she wanted to go to Mass at St. Mark's Catholic Church. So Anthony, Catherine, and 4 of their children headed to Shakopee on Spring Lake Road. And they were driving on a 2-seated platform wagon to attend the morning service.
That's my grandma, Minnie Biskin.
Oh, you know, oh really? So that's interesting. That's why I put, when I find things like that, I like the name of that.
I had known she worked for Catherine.
Yeah. So anyway, they were heading downtown, and you know where McDonald's is, kind of that area where the railroad track is there? The bolt on the wagon dropped off, and they jumped out, and the horse turned and struck a tree. And Catherine was flown out, struck a tree, and she died from the concussion. Okay, she was 39 years old, and I think what you have 8 or 9 kids at that point. So the father, Anthony, ended up marrying again and having some more children there. But it's just an interesting story about Catherine. We talk about Ramsey Street, you know. Why? That's because that was the governor of Minnesota. I mentioned this one because this is now further, I gotta figure out where we are. Anyway.
County Road 21, pretty much.
What was
County
this?
Road 21.
Yeah, okay. The
Her guy.
yeah, Memorial Drive. I just mentioned this one because it's about like how recently there's still our thing. He was born here in Shakopee, graduated from high school in Shakopee, served in the Army, and was the first Minnesota to die in the conflict. He received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, and they ended up then naming that thing after him. And again, if you go to Valley Cemetery, again, that's the thing is there. So it's just kind of interesting how the tie-in still goes into that. Finally, I think I have a couple of little short ones. I'm going to go pretty quickly. This Other Day Circle, which is actually as part of the Shakopee, Metawakan, Sioux community. That's why the color is a little different. But I still bring this up because Other Day was a really important family. John Other Day, you notice because I have my stroke, I can't say the name correctly, so I switched over to there. But just so you know, he was really important because during the he ended up converting to Christianity and was farming here. He met a woman, they got married, but what's interesting is that when they had the conflict, well, here's what he said, that he gave up the war path and commenced working the earth for a living. And this was in 1869. But in 1862, during the U.S.-Dakota War, he heard about the attack. He went to the agency and had 62 people who were hidden in a warehouse, and he stood guard all night, and then he led them on a 3-day journey to safety. And so after that, the families went to Hutchinson, Glencoe, Carver, Shakopee, and St. Paul. But Congress rewarded Other Day for his efforts to rescue the 62 people. He was given $2,500. They actually said, this is kind of interesting, that the reward was supposed to be $10,000, but the Congress amended it to the lesser amount.
Imagine
Yeah, imagine that is right. But why that's important, this person is the sister-in-law of him. Hafsina Black Flute Lucy Other Day. She lived here in Shakopee. She used to make her rounds in Shakopee with her daughter, Minnie Other Day, Weldon. She was almost blind and she used a walker stick to move around town, and she would gather food from the Tinto or the prairie. Okay. And the reason why this is kind of interesting, and then they also, both her and her son, they used to get watercress, and they also used to sew, they'd do beadwork. And they'd sell these things for $1 each, the thing. And many people remember Minnie Other Day, Weldon. That's a picture of her. And she is quite well known here in Shakopee, but it's really interesting. I kind of switch along here. She was born in a teepee here on the north side of the river, here in Tintotama. Her grandmother was the sister of Chief Shakopee, remember, who started the name Shakopee, where the city was named after, okay? And again, this is just saying again that she made these beautiful different things with beads and stuff that were $1 each. And that's how she made money to take care of her children. And this is Minnie and her husband, Charles, and their first 2 children. But why its connection is the grandson of Minnie and the great-grandson of Hafstina is Charlie Vig, who is now the chairman of the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community. So isn't that kind of interesting tying about how that's all connected? And he was our classmate of mine, graduated in 1978. I brought this one up just because there's a place called Boiling Spring Lane here in Shakopee, but I wanted people to realize that Boiling Springs really is not really the best name for that. It's actually called Maka Yasoto, which is an Indian name because it was a important Dakota place in this area. It's actually between, well, it's Shakopee / Savage. They both take claim of it, I guess. And it's because there's a farm where it kind of bubbles a lot, you know, and that's why it was is well known still. It finally, they were going to take it and build houses around it, and Metawakan Sioux community fought, and they ended up protecting it because it is a sacred site. Scott Street, just so you know, that's related to, he was an Army general. He had never been to Minnesota or Shakopee, so, but he still got a street. And then finally, I'll do one more, Veerling Drive. You see that's here in Shakopee. And there are a lot of Veerlings in Shakopee, but Henry George Veerling built a house in Shakopee after moving from Eagle Creek. Eagle Creek is really now part of Shakopee, but at that time it was a separate place east of downtown. And he built a house on 3rd Street, just east of St. Mark's School. And then several years later, he opened the Veerling Cigar Shop out in the rear of the house. And he used to have this brand called the Diamonds S cigars. Apparently it was very popular. I hate cigars myself, but anyway, it used to be sold in Shakopee, but also the whole area, like in Minneapolis, St. Paul and stuff, is very popular. And it's interesting that some of the people who apprenticed under them, but then eventually their son, his 2 sons, I guess, John and George, continued manufacturing the cigars. And then, let's see, when John Veerling died, the old shop was abandoned as a cigar factory, but the house was still there. And then in February of 1935, the house and business were torn down, destroying the landmark. So it's just interesting that there is a lot of interesting history of like the Veerling, all the different tie-into so many streets, so that's just kind of an interesting thing. And then this is just me, because I'm a former English teacher. There's across the street, Stone Meadows. Take that S off of that. Drives me crazy. But I can't do it, but I just feel like it. And as I said, Mr. Olson is not amused. You know, I can just see him not being crazy about that. Anyway, you know, we do have a book that's here, which is the first of a series of books that we're doing. This is on women in early Shakopee, and it talks about 10 women who were here early on and stories about them. And we're doing several other ones in process that are coming soon. One's on The Streets Where You Live, Murder, Mayhem, and Mystery in Shakopee, Home Sweet Home, Sparkling, and We Were Here Too, which is about African Americans in early Shakopee. Those are coming up soon, so just keep an eye out for that. And then finally, as we conclude, we do have in Memorial Park, if you would go down there and park where the duck pond area is, park there, you'll see some signs of some of the steps that has information about the history of Shakopee. And it has pictures down below, and above it talks information about it. And it goes, there's 10 signs. Right now 3 are up, the rest are coming soon. And we are doing a fundraiser next
Thursday. Yep, coming up.
Thursday. Yeah, what's today too? Oh, so this coming Thursday at the
Turtle Social Center.
Turtles thing. It's $48 a person. I do have tickets that everybody wants, but we're using that money to actually do signs, and we're doing signs throughout the whole downtown area. And then finally, that's just information if you have any other questions. So any other last questions?
I have,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when you mentioned about the Indians and the white people marrying, and it was a lot of times to help out or whatever the case may be. So was there no concerns or issues at that time amongst the Indians or the whites as far as the interracial stuff? Because back then, wasn't that something that just was frowned upon regardless of if you were Asian or Indian or black or whatever, that you stayed with your own kind?
Yes, kind of. Because of the fur trade, that it was different because at that time there weren't a lot of white women in the area, and so that's why they did that. Plus, again, it was to make a connection to the tribe in order to have that. It was not necessarily, well, for both the Indians and the whites, it may or may not been, there's positive and negatives for all of that, obviously, but it happened, and it happened a lot, especially during the fur trade time. You still have people who are now tied in. For example, I'm going to use an example, I hope I use it if that's okay. Wes actually is part Dakota. Not, I mean, look at him, he doesn't look like anything like a Dakota, right? And but it's like, you know, way back, but at one point there was, because who was around and how they ended up getting together, so that happened. Most African Americans who are in this area tend to marry Dakota women because they weren't allowed to, they weren't, you know, people were really frowned upon with whites, and the only other option there was that. So that happened a lot with that. That animosity was there for both, you know, when Shakopee, the city became, I mean the town I should say, when it first got together in 50, let's say 1852 was built, started, then expanded. By 1857, there's mixing happening anyway, but you just didn't know or didn't talk about it. But people who were white, who lived in town, especially women, were afraid of the Indians. They thought that, you know, they were afraid of them. And, you know, the Dakota, you know, felt that they were there first, but also they had a different view of the process, as opposed to it wasn't buying land, it was being shared. And so there's a conflict between that, and that continued still, I suppose, probably still today, probably in many ways.
Then I was wondering too, all the different people that died and you said were buried here and have their graves, and it's all in Valley Cemetery. Was nobody Catholic then?
Yes, so there was a Catholic cemetery, which is, what is it called now?
Right, it's Calvary, it's still
Calvary,
there.
yeah,
But how come,
still there.
so like all these
But
people that started the town, none of them were Catholic though?
Some of them were, some of them weren't, but they still would often be buried at Valley Cemetery because it was the closest one.
Okay.
And it was still out of town. So, and in fact, the other cemetery, the Catholic one, there was a lot of people who were complaining because it was so far. And that's why they ended up building the one that became St. Mark's and then St. Mary's and then combined together in town.
Right.
But if you look at like the ones here, I'm just doing a few examples of where they had names, but there are several people who are really interesting that come up in some of my other presentations that were buried at the Catholic cemetery or the Catholic Cemetery over
Okay.
there if it was early.
Okay.
Yeah.
When I opened the messenger from Shakopee a couple of weeks ago, I noticed on page, I think it's 8, there's a story there with people in it. One of the fellows was my grandfather, and the other person that was in it is my mother, Janet Strunk.
Okay.
I think that's the
So-
Hind Inn.
Yeah. There is a Strunk,
There was a pharmacy in Shakopee.
yes,
Yeah,
which is on the north side. It ended up being, finally, it was on what is now Pablo's.
yeah.
Before that, yeah,
And
before
the
that.
original pharmacy was down on First Street.
Right, on the
Yeah.
north side.
I'm the
Yeah.
last of the Strunks.
Okay, oh, good. Mona Strunk is,
Yes.
she used to have a lot of good stories about that too.
And she's passed away now.
But it's also interesting because I haven't seen a Strunk street or,
No.
do we?
On the west side, isn't there like a Strunks Road kind of by west of
Yeah.
where the mall is?
Because I want to add that because then I
Yeah,
should
it's
add
on the
that
north
into.
side.
Kind of by where the
69
brewery rooms
there.
are?
Yeah, because the same thing, it's like, those are one of the early families who were here, who stayed, and are well-known because of several things that they did, at the time.
Yeah, because
And generation after generation.
it was Heinen's Confectionery.
Yes, I was just gonna say that.
And then my mother bought it from her parents, and then it was Jan's card store.
Right.
And oh boy. And now, and then it was Lady Di's, but that's no
Mhm.
longer there, so they
So
stripped
now
it off the bar.
So now it's a bar.
I used to live in
Hardwick
that
bar.
building.
Yeah, I remember that. It was I was a little sad because the Babes, they took, between the two, there was the artwork that was there, they took it down, they couldn't do it, and I have a hard time with that part
I
because
think
it's
if
such
my
a
mother
part
saw
of
that
history.
building right now, she would turn over.
Yeah, you're right. Really true. But that's why I think we try to, like we make sure we had pictures of that before it was torn down. And we're trying to make sure that the Shakopee Heritage Society we're trying to get some of that information and put that into books because it's so important that the generation, I talk with the 6th graders here in Shakopee as part of, because they are supposed to learn about them. And you'd be surprised they have no clue about some of the stuff. So we want to do more with that, so. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
When they are building new developments and stuff and they're looking for road names, do they come to you and ask?
No, but they should. Well, not me, but we do talk, I do talk to the city of Shakopee. And recently we were talking about it too, and we said, we can give you 20 great names that you should for sure put, So we're working on it slowly because they're continuing to add more places. They might as well, if they're going to put names, I don't need another Jennifer Street because there's a lot of Jennifers around. But and there's nothing wrong with Jennifer. My sister's named Jennifer, but I think some of the history should be put in those names as much as possible.
And
That's what I think.
Didn't they share that our understanding is a developer proposes the names to
Yeah.
the city of here's
Right.
the
And so
developers?
sometimes they just do, their friends or their children or something. But I just feel that they need to think a little bit more about the history of Shakopee so that we have that documented in a different way. And so that we can share it, with that. Obviously, the first streets were all named with that. Just like at one point, all the streets over there were all named presidents, remember when that kind of stuff. So it's the same thing. It'd just be nice to have a little bit more about the history of Shakopee, I think. So I agree with that. So yes, if you are a builder or know any builders, let them know. We'd be happy to help. We have a lot of suggestions. We do actually send them to the city now, so they at least will remember, to remind that, we have some possibles and like I said, some of the ones I just talked about in here that like Quinn or something should really be recognized because there is a tie-in to the history of Shakopee. Okay? All right, thank you. Have a good day. It's a
Thank
beautiful
you.
day up today.